I'm Junie Johnson. I'm one of the deputy directors that works over at the Ministry of Justice. Alongside Nina and the Criminal Justice Alliance, we came together last year at a roundtable event to begin discussing the topic of racial diversity in the criminal justice workforce. The roundtable actually brought together a wide range of organisations from across the criminal justice sector to identify the challenges and opportunities of building a diverse workforce. Last year's roundtable actually helped us to identify and focus on 4 key areas, which we'll be building on today, of recruitment, retention, progression, and actually understanding how we measure and obtain a meaningful impact of having a more diverse workforce. We identified a number of challenges last year, and it was really interesting to be able to explore some of that, and in different areas across the criminal justice sector, including magistrates' courts, for example. We had some very powerful testimonies, I think, one of which I know Nina's going to touch on, from our service users. That was really helpful in anchoring us in relation to why we're here and why it's important that we have a more diverse workforce across the criminal justice system. And we also heard about some good practice, and we shared quite a bit of good practice. And one of the ones that come to mind was the success stories that we were getting at the time from the parole board, and I'm sure Caroline and some of the other colleagues from parole board are on the call as well today. But today's event is all about building on this work, and it would be amiss for me not to mention some of the things that are going on and happening around the world at the moment. So the COVID-19 pandemic has no doubt brought a material impact, and has had a material impact on how we go about our daily lives at the moment. And the fact that we can't be together in a room like we were last year just goes to demonstrate how times have changed. We're also seeing disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 and the disease amongst the BAME community, and no doubt that might be something that is picked up today. And of course, we're also witnessing global protests in relation to racial injustice, which for me brings what we're doing today into a really fine focus, because the criminal justice sector for me represents a key cornerstone of our society, so that we're all in our respective delivery, scrutiny or advocacy roles, forms the foundation of which societies are usually built and are built. So I hope today actually provides us with yet another unique opportunity to continue addressing the specific workforce challenges we've known that exist across the criminal justice system. And I thank you in advance for your attendance and look forward to your constructive input today. That's enough from me. Nina, do you want to say a few words?
Junior. So I'm Nina Champion. I'm the director of the Criminal Justice Alliance, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this event. We had around 200 people register, which is incredible. I seem to be using the phrase now more than ever at the moment for the reasons that Junior outlined. This piece of work, which the CJA committed to in our strategy last year, is now more than ever a critical conversation that we need to have, and more importantly, a time for urgent action. Each part of the criminal justice workforce, from policing to prisons, knows this is an issue, and there are many people working behind the scenes to try and build a more diverse criminal justice workforce, including our panellists and many of you attending this event today. Through this event and through follow-up workshops in the next few weeks, we really want to focus on solutions, identify good practice, and share those across the criminal justice system, so that these pockets of effort and innovation could be more strategically aligned. We need a whole system response to this, a national action plan, and to ensure that it receives the resources and the political leadership that it deserves and needs. The Lord Chancellor, who I'm hoping, if technical issues don't get in the way, will help us open this event today, said in his swearing-in speech, "We still need to see more diversity in all its forms throughout the ranks of the professions and in the judiciary, and I will do all I can to promote this agenda in my time as Lord Chancellor." So the CJA look forward to working with him and others to take this work forward. We'll develop recommendations for policy and practice, which we hope will result in a fairer and more effective criminal justice system, improve outcomes for individuals, and increase trust and confidence. And as Junior mentioned, I want to read a quote from a person that we used last year, at the round table we held, who was working for the CJA on release on temporary licence from prison. And he was actually writing a report for us that we launched last November called Change from Within, which was around increasing the lived experience of people with lived experience in the criminal justice workforce. So I asked him why racial diversity was also important in a fit-for-purpose criminal justice workforce. And this is what he said. When one goes through the court process, they're told a jury of their peers will determine their fate. And yet, when one looks around the courtroom and the judge is white, prosecutor is white, defence barristers and lawyers are white, the jury is white, at this stage, there always is a feeling that the context of my defence will probably not be understood. Upon entering the prison system, most of the staff are white, and it dawns on you that equality will be the duration of your sentence an alien concept. The lack of diversity entrenches sentiments of them and us. As long as the system operates in racial silos, it will never progress beyond racial stereotypes. It's these stereotypes that inform people's access to healthcare, education, sentence progression. The criminal justice system, in my view, has perceptions that Black people are predisposed to violence and criminality. Workforce diversity, in my view, can go some way to breaking down those stereotypes and reducing discriminatory behaviours. I really look forward to today's discussion, which now more than ever needs our focus, our attention and our action. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Nina. Opening today's event, we have Justice Secretary, Lord Chancellor Robert Buckland and Shadow Justice Secretary David Lammy. Do we have the Lord Chancellor, has he managed to arrive yet? Do we know?
I have, thank you, Junior.
Welcome.
How are you? Nice to see you.
I'm good, I'm good.
Great to see. I'm great to see everybody on screen, and thank you very much for inviting me and organising the follow-up to the session that was held last summer. And I can't think of a, frankly, the better timing and more appropriate timing for an event like this, because we've seen from the appalling events in Minneapolis and the ensuing surge of feeling, the demonstrations, the expressions of a mix of views and feelings, from despair through to anger, through to a sense of tiredness, that people have just had enough of the situation. All this, I think, has come across incredibly powerfully to all of us, watching and observing and expressing our view. And it's a stark reminder that although in many respects we have made some proper progress, there is still a huge amount to do, bearing in mind the unavoidable truth that prejudice is still within all our respective societies. I think the right to peaceful protest is a vital hallmark of our democracy. But of course, it must happen under the rule of law, and all of us in the Criminal Justice Alliance and the wider criminal justice community understand that better than most. But the rule of law is all about equality under the law, and getting that point across to people and making sure that that is an increasing reality, given the points that Nina just made, is of course part of our work as criminal justice providers. We must never accept criminal behaviour as a tool of protest. That's clear, and it needs to be emphasised. What I want to see is more of a sense of the country coming together, as we have to fight COVID-19, coming together in a way that achieves something and does something constructive. And we all know that words are easy, it's the actions that really, really matter here. And what I said in my opening, in my remarks when I became Lord Chancellor, were words that I felt and continue to feel very deeply, and words that will be matched and are being matched by the actions that we are taking, the actions that we need to take in order to address these issues, to overcome them, and to allow our society to move forward in a way that involves everybody, wherever we're from and whatever background we might come from. I have an honour of representing Swindon. It's a diverse community with a growing vein community as well, diverse communities. We believe in our town that it doesn't matter where you're from, it's what you do and what you offer our community and what you're capable of that really matters. And that sense of it's more than a tolerance, it's actually coming together and embracing the difference and working collectively together. There's a real sense of that in the community that I represent, and I spend a lot of time working on that and propagating that and encouraging that, because I believe that actions speak much louder than words. Now, we've obviously been working, and David, I think, is on the line. The review that he led has been a vital part of the process of change. And the response that we published in February, the 2-year update to the recommendations that were made in the review, was an important milestone in not just looking at what we've done, but what else we need to do. One of the things the original review looked at was how other jurisdictions that are similar to ours, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they've used innovative ways to address racial disparities in their justice systems, whether it's in the way in which plea options are dealt with, community engagement, the setup of the courts themselves. And I want to take that work forward to examine in more detail the experience of those other countries, to see how we can apply those principles here and to take that action wherever necessary. I mean, what happened in Minneapolis has really sparked a global movement, and other jurisdictions, not least the US, will no doubt be considering their responses too. And I'm keen that we keenly observe that work so that we can absorb those lessons and apply them here where appropriate. And one thing we know is that making sure that the system mirrors the makeup of our society is frankly one of the ways that we can build confidence in the idea that the system is not for or against any one group of people, but instead pursues justice for all. But actually what should drive us to make progress on this is the desire that everyone should have when they turn up for work to do a good job. We know that healthy and successful organizations are those that are diverse, those that don't fall prey to groupthink, those that don't hold back people with merit. It's not a duty to have a diverse organization, but if we want better outcomes from the criminal justice system, frankly, it's common sense. And that's what we really need to drive home here. Now, the numbers are moving in the right direction. We've seen, for example, an almost 1% increase in the proportion of BAME people working in the prison and probation service since last year. But of course, there's so much more to do. And that's why the session today is very important. And as we examine the issues and the barriers facing BAME people, I hope that we can take the events of the last few weeks and redouble those efforts to create a justice system that is truly fair and characterized by equality for all people under the law. And I just want to end on this basis. Having spent a lot of my professional life working in the criminal justice system, representing people from all backgrounds, it's the job of the advocate to step into the shoes of the people that we represent, to understand in depth the experiences that they've gone through, and to make sure that is represented with force, without fear or favour. That's what I've done all my professional life, and that's what I want to continue to do as Secretary of State and Lord Chancellor. Thank you for that opportunity. I wish you all the very best. Thank you.
Thanks, Secretary of State. I'm now going to hand over to David Lammy.
Hello, thank you very much. Great to join you and great to follow the Secretary of State. Look, we're meeting at an extraordinary time in the world, frankly, and in relation to the subject that brings us together, clearly there is deep concern across our own country, not just because of what has happened in the United States, but in part because we've seen these images before, because the nature of the presidency in Donald Trump and the way in which there's a perception that this has been stoked, frankly, and because here in our own country, there remain issues of structural discrimination and prejudice. And that's what we're responding to, and that's what needs acceleration. I think there's a growing sense in Britain that we know what needs to be done. There's no need for further reviews, no need for further inquiries, probably no need for further legislation, or that might be appropriate in some areas. There's a real need for action, and that action requires leadership, genuine leadership from the top that drives this forward and says that this is a #1 priority. Now, two things flow from that. The first thing is to say that I was moved and pleased to be asked by David Cameron now 5 years ago to lead a review into the disproportionality of the criminal justice system. And the reason I accepted that offer, and I was pleased that that attempt to reach across the aisle had been made, was because, of course, what it said was that this issue is important. It's so important that we're going to make it a cross-party issue. And that's the spirit into which I did my review and the way in which I've tried since to work with the Ministry of Justice. But it is also to say that governments come and go. I'm now on to my third Prime Minister since David Cameron, and understandably, each Prime Minister has their own track record on these issues. And notwithstanding what Robert has said, I think this community will understand that across the criminal justice system, there will be those that want to understand that this remains the priority that they believe that it must do. Now, my own judgment, and I want to try and ensure that this isn't partisan, because I just think the issues are too important to be partisan, is that I do think there's been progress in the prison service, particularly on recruitment, and in the probation service. And I do think that there's been the ethnicity board that the department set up. And I certainly have seen parts of the criminal justice respond to what I had to say. But notwithstanding coronavirus, notwithstanding Brexit, which dominated the cycle, obviously, for a significant period since I produced my review, the pace of change, the urgency of change is something that, as the reviewer, you would expect me to raise. And I've got the most recent figures in front of me. The race trends show that in the Ministry of Justice, 21% of staff have identified as Black, Asian, or minority ethnic. This has barely increased in the last 5 years. And it's important also to think about what levels those staff are at within the organisation. Also recognises that when we use the phrase BAME, and I've always believed it's a very unsatisfactory term, there are differences across different ethnic groups. And indeed, in my review, I flagged up, for example, the serious challenges that remain in society in relation to, and within the criminal justice system, in relation to people from a gypsy and traveller background. I would be very surprised if they're reflected in those figures in the Ministry of Justice, for example. So right across the family of Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, there remain significant challenges. The picture in the CPS, again, is 20%, and this hasn't increased in 5 years. The police service, so now I'm talking about the police service nationally, not just here in London, the figure is 7%. That is dire in relation to the overall figure in the population of 14%. And actually, if you looked at the cohort, the age group of police, is even worse than that. So you'll understand why there is historic issues that still exist between the police and between Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities when the figure is so low. And by the way, let me say that recruitment does not mean you solve issues of race and structural discrimination. If that were the case, there would be no protests against the LA Police Department or the New York Police Department who've cracked the figures in relation to recruitment. I just think it's the beginning of rebuilding trust. But it is only the beginning of rebuilding trust. And so when we raise these issues, the fact that we languish so far behind the national population, which is sitting at 15%, and then amongst young people, the population that's sitting at about 21% of BAME in the community, it is why this is so significant and why it's a big challenge, I think, for the overall criminal justice family and the MOJ family, of course, is because in terms of the client group, the groups that are using the justice system and the criminal justice system particularly, then clearly there's a lot to do. And I compared it at the time I did my review to the education system, where in London, 20 years ago, it was recognized that we had to recruit a new cadre of Black, Asian and minority ethnic teachers. It is, I don't think there's a London authority now where there isn't several Black, Asian or minority ethnic head teachers. Impossible to find in London, and hard actually, certainly to walk into a secondary school and not find a cadre of Black, Asian and minority ethnic teaching staff. And you needed to get to that place if you were going to educate Londoners to be what they need to be. And it's similar, I think, in the criminal justice system because of the nature of the criminal justice system. You do need to take the business of recruitment seriously, and it can be done. I've often given the judiciary a hard time and the Judicial Appointments Commission a hard time because of the pace of change. It's risen from 7% to 8%. And of course, we know that when we look at that 8% figure, we're not really talking within that about the recruitment of Black lawyers to the upper echelons of the judiciary. And they've been there for years. I qualified now 25 years ago. There are very senior barristers, very senior solicitors not making their way really into the ranks of the judiciary, not getting the feedback, not getting the hand-holding. I just think the pace has been slow, and it's why, and by the way, of course, it's not just in relation to ethnic diversity. There are serious challenges still in terms of gender diversity in the judiciary. Now, it can be done. Recently, the parole board contacted me. How do we do this? And leadership from the top, being serious about it. In a part of the country where people said it can't be done, the Northeast, they cracked it. A recruitment round, huge success, quite extraordinary. I think it's been the best example of recent recruitment in the criminal justice and justice system in this last period. I hope they can replicate it when they look to recruit in the Midlands shortly. And I hope that other parts of the justice system will look at what the parole board did with leadership right from the top, the right kind of recruitment, a lot of hand-holding and a determination to have panels that are diverse to crack it. And that's what needs to be done right across the system. So it can be done. Actually, when I did my review, also we found that the CPS had been it's stalled, but it had been relatively successful at recruiting a cadre of Black, Asian and minority ethnic lawyers into the pool. But it's not just about training. It's not just at the most junior levels. It's not just about counting the security guards at the front door. It's about all the way up into the organisation. I believe in targets. I was disappointed when I set a target for the judiciary, but the government rejected it. I now believe I should have set a quota and then perhaps we'd have got a target. But I set a target, and I do believe you should set yourself a target. I do believe the KPI matters. I do believe that senior leadership should have it in their appraisals and should be held to account to bring people on. And of course, I believe in training as well. All of those things are necessary if we are going to pull this off. look, we're having this conversation at a time when 51% of our young offenders institution are filled with Black, Asian and minority ethnic young people. We're having this conversation where if you walk into our prisons, the overrepresentation of Black men is actually worse in our prisons, as I said in my review, than they are in the United States per capita. This is an extraordinarily serious challenge. And as I say, it goes beyond just issues of structural racism. It's a prerequisite for trust. If you think about those balance of those scales of justice and the trust that communities have to have in the criminal justice system, this is very, very serious indeed. And what we found in the review is first-generation immigrants come into Britain trusting the criminal justice system and the justice system because they're comparing it to the places from which they come. But their children, there's a rapid decline in trust as they come into contact, particularly with the police, but as they experience the criminal justice system or indeed the justice system, things change rapidly. And let me just say, whilst the emphasis of my review was on the criminal justice system, we know, don't we, that there are other areas that are equally important that could do with the sort of scrutiny that I gave it. And one area that I believe often gets left out is the family law jurisdiction has huge impacts on Black, Asian and minority ethnic people in terms of the children that are taken into care, adoption, all of those areas, really, really important. And of course, divorce. And that is an area where I receive lots of emails, lots of letters, lots of communication, that there is much to do, frankly, and there are issues of systemic discrimination that people believe still exist. So I hope that gives you a sense of the concerns that I raised, the progress that has been made in some places and the best practice that we've seen in some areas, but a hell of a lot to do. And on the recent figures, I was disappointed that when they were published not so long ago, they were sort of in the back of an annex and a schedule. You had to really dig on the website to find them. And I think it's important that the department is front-footed, is clear about the figures as they stand, is clear about the ambition, and is able to say we've met things here, we haven't met things there. And obviously, as you would expect, now I'm in this new role as Shadow Justice Secretary, I will be pressing on these issues. I'll attempt to do it in a way that maintains the consensus that begun this work in the first place. But I was pleased to see the leader of the opposition outranking me and putting these issues to Boris Johnson last week, because this week at Prime Minister's Questions, because it's him communicating that my review, like the Windrush review and the issues that people are protesting about, remain very, very important. And the Prime Minister of the day, Boris Johnson, should take them as seriously as his predecessors appeared to have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, Lord Chancellor. I'm probably not going to open it up to questions because I know that you both need to get off to the house and they've got some things that you need to
We've got a statement. Robert's got a statement and I've got to respond to him.
Exactly. So I'm sure...
David, I'll see you in a few minutes, David. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Socially distanced, of course.
Of course.
Thank you very much. Keep up the work, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you both.
Keep going. Keep working.
Okay.
Thank you.
So before I introduce the panel, just a couple of things in terms of how you can raise questions to the panel I'm about to introduce. So in the top right-hand corner of your screens or devices, depending on what you're using, you'll see that there's a Q&A button. So if you've got any questions that you want to raise to the panel members, please do use the Q&A function that's there, and we'll capture all of those questions and try and get as many of those to the panel as possible. I will also commit to making sure that those that we don't get round to answering, we will make sure that we get responses back to you. But it's really important that you ask any of those questions in the Q&A panel, because actually that's where we're going to be recording them as opposed to in the chat. on the actual Zoom. Okay, so just a couple of things from me. In addition to that, we've got quite a packed agenda. So what we've done, we've got 6 panelists, but so we've split them into 2 sections. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and talk about their roles and their thoughts and views around the aims of today and what we're discussing. So, and if each of the panel members can keep that to about 5 minutes, that'd be really helpful, because then that would allow us to get more time for questions and answers. So without any further ado, let me introduce the first set of panelists, which you should have got in your brochures, but it is Tola Munro, and she's the president, or that is the president of the National Black Police Association. And I hope I pronounced the next one correctly, Hauwa Shehu, the chair of the Crown Prosecution Service Muslim Network, and Tanya Robinson, OBE, Head of Diversity and Inclusion in Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. So if I can start, ask Tola to do her introduction first, and then we'll start from there.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me nice and clearly. I'm speaking to you from Bristol, which I'll come back to later on. I'm a sergeant with Avon and Somerset Constabulary, and I'm also president of the National Black Police Association, and I'll be speaking to you with regard to that latter role rather than my policing role. Interesting to follow up from what David Lammy said with regards to policing, but obviously we are talking about across the criminal justice sector, so please don't think that I don't respect the work done by my colleagues here as well. But particularly in terms of policing, I think we're aware that the current issues, a number of things going on at the moment, have to be seen in the context of Windrush and all that meant in terms of the hostile environment and how it's affected people. Has to also be seen in the context of the COVID-19 regulations, which obviously has an effect on the protests that we're seeing at the moment. But specifically, mostly so for those particular protests related to George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter issues that are going on. We've done a lot of work on the COVID front to work with our colleagues, and you'll all be aware that there is a disproportionality in terms of contracting COVID-19 for our communities. Our Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities, but also in terms of the mortality rates, quite significant, and we've seen similarly high figures in policing. In terms of George Floyd then, you know, we can understand why, despite the COVID regulations, people are getting out and protesting and making their voices heard, and we really do hope this is a watershed moment for policing. And the reason I say that is in the context of what we're talking about today, which is the recruitment, the retention, and progression, and meaningful or measuring impact of Black and Asian people in policing. We really can't talk about recruitment. We really can't talk about the 20,000 officers that have been promised by the Home Office, been promised by the Prime Minister, without those contexts. And although we're seeing increasing numbers of people coming into policing and being attracted to policing for that, that will provide a backdrop. I estimate that for some people it will mean that they will no longer consider policing, but hopefully for other people they will consider policing as a career to affect their communities and to make a difference in that regard. We really would encourage it, and we work both nationally and locally towards that, but also we want to encourage people to join us in terms of doing that. I'm going to just show you a couple of things that I just want to share with you, and then hopefully I will hand over to other people as well. So in terms of the work that we're doing as the NBPA, we've recently released, hopefully everybody can see this statistics that are coming up here. And give me a thumbs up from Nina if you can see what I've just posted. Okay, so if you can't, I'll just talk through that. We do a survey of forces every 2 years, and we give this information back to forces. This is the national level stuff. And I'll just quickly show that there are still disproportionalities in the disciplinary system with regards to how people are dealt with. That has an impact on how we recruit people. Communities will recognise that and know that there are issues with regard to that. There's a disproportionality in terms of grievance processes and how people are dealt with through the employment tribunal system. And specifically, there are other issues with regards to the regulation procedures. Those are the procedures where officers may well lose their jobs and are much more likely to do that than for other areas that we talked about already. we've given a key of that to other people, but in reflection to that, and in regards to other issues that have been raised, we are looking at reorganising our own governance structures to help assist people in dealing with that. And again, I'll just quickly, if I can, if this will work through, I've got Robert Buckland's come up there. But we are looking at reorganising our structures across it to work in a more regional basis to assist people with that regard, because we're aware of some issues. So hopefully that will give you some idea of what we're doing with regard to that. We'll give you some idea of the issues that we face with regards to the ongoing issues. I think that stopped working for me, but I shall stop sharing that. But policing is very much concerned about that. And coming back to Bristol, you'll be aware that a certain former slave traders statue in Bristol ended up in the water, which some people consider it quite apposite, bearing in mind what happened to black slaves that he was involved in transporting. I can't possibly comment on that, but I know it's provoked a number of issues across the nation with responses from the far right to protect statues and the like. So we're aware of all that going on, but hopefully, as I said, this is a golden opportunity to improve representation in policing and across the criminal justice sector. Thank you very much.
Tola, thank you very much for that, and apologies for mistaking you for a lady.
It's happened before.
So
and,
I'm now going to,
with respect to my colleagues, that's great.
I'm now going to hand over to Hauwa, Shehu, the chair of the CPS Muslim Network.
Thank you so much, Junior. My name's Hauwa Shehu, and I am, as Junior said, chair of the CPS Muslim Network. I'm also the mentoring coordinator for the CPS BAME network. What I wanted to do was give you guys a little bit of an insight into the Muslim Network, kind of the work that we do, what we do, and I'll try and provide a bit of commentary sort of in relation to some of the topics that we've talked about in terms of the relevancy of this diversity to what we do. To put things in a bit of context, I'm a criminal barrister by qualification. I've been with the CPS approximately 5 years now, worked in the Magistrates Court unit as a frontline prosecutor going to court, joined the International Division, also worked within the Extradition unit, and currently I'm a District Crown Prosecutor, so I manage a team of prosecutors in the Magistrates Court at the moment. So I'm going to try sharing my screen, and hopefully this technology will work. So let's see. Again, if someone can give me a thumbs up if that's worked and you can see the PowerPoint. Brilliant. Okay, so just really briefly, I'm going to try and whiz through this. But essentially, at CPS, we've got a number of staff networks. I've listed them all there. The National Black Crown Prosecution Association is our BAME staff network. We've got a disability staff network, one for the LGBTQ community, a prosecution Christian fellowship, and a Muslim network. All of our networks are led by staff like myself who do this alongside our day jobs. All of the things that we aim to achieve with it is essentially to address diversity and inclusion, increase public confidence, give back to our community, support staff, reflect the society that we serve, and ensure that within our organisations there's a better understanding of our communities. We also do support learning and development, which is of course linked to the progression issues that we've been talking about. I'm also just trying to keep an eye on time, sorry. With the communities that we're talking about. And I've also put their identity and community, because obviously when we're talking about retention, there's a lot there to do about how much do you feel that you can be yourself in a workplace, and how invested can you then get into the workplace if you don't feel that you can. So some people might be asking, why do we have a Muslim network? Our Muslim network was set up just after 9/11, sort of in the wave of a huge backlash of Islamophobia, where we thought there needed to be more understanding of Muslim staff within the CPS, but also within the communities. Within David Lammy's review, two of the communities that were identified as having the lowest confidence in the system were obviously the Black community, but also the Muslim community. I took over in October 2018 to relaunch the network because there was such a need. I felt like there really was this disparity between the community and between the system, if I can call it that. And internally, we do a lot of work around supporting the CPS in policy consultations, providing multi-faith spaces in the workplace. We represent the CPS at wider diversity and inclusion meetings and events. We also do get involved in supporting staff and casework. Tola touched upon sort of grievance procedures and how our communities are disproportionately impacted in those. So although we're not a trade union, we do support staff in that respect. We're also in the process of designing faith awareness training, essentially creating more faith literacy around our prosecutors so that when they're engaging with victims, witnesses and defendants at court, they really do sort of know what they're talking about and understand the communities that they're engaging with. And then a big part of what we do is simply about empowering our communities, educating our colleagues and again the community about ourselves, and just making sure that we're currently engaged so we're never out of touch. The work of the Muslim Network I think is important because also looking at the Muslim population in this country, of course it is pretty much majority BAME, so we have that sort of intersection there. In terms of community engagement, we go out into communities frequently, and one of the things that we do a lot of work on are hate crime awareness workshops. Again, these are lawyers, admin staff who do this alongside their day jobs, go out into the communities that we consider our own communities to make sure that they understand sort of how to deal with hate crime, encourage them to report it, make sure that we're following up and hearing what are the actual complaints from the community, what are the issues and why is the confidence low in terms of what we're doing. We try and do this nationally, and some of the work we also do is involving supporting a women's centre in East London. You can see some images there from some of our hate crime awareness training, also our Black History Month event that we did highlighting sort of Black Muslims. We also work with schools. Again, this is a big part of the recruitment aspect of things. We do go out into schools. I think CPS still has almost, if I could call it, a branding issue where members of the community don't necessarily understand what the distinction is between the police and the CPS. They don't realise that we're independent of each other. And so actually when we're seeking to diversify our workforce, a big part of that is going out and talking to young people about the different career paths that they can take. We do a lot of careers events, and I've put there some of the work that we have done with the police force to sort of illustrate the fact that actually some of the good work and best practice that's been done across our organisations, we do try and share. So we supported Tola and his colleagues at the Black Police Association conference recently, along with my colleague who runs the BAME network for CPS, and we've also worked with the Association of Muslim Police. I put some details of our social media, which there's a bit more of that you can see on there. Some of the highlights of the things that we've done is we have something called a Faith and Success speaker series, which is all about essentially showing role models and positive imagery as well, and positive examples to motivate and inspire our staff to show that actually faith is not something that holds you back in terms of succeeding within this sector. We had some high profile Ramadan events, and as I mentioned, we also support professional development through quite a established mentoring program. I think from my perspective, obviously individually, I'm a Black woman, I'm a Muslim, and with the killing of George Floyd, for the Black community, I think a lot of people have been using the word shocked. For the Black community particularly, we weren't shocked. We really weren't shocked. I think what's been more shocking is how a lot of non-Black communities are now responding to this. And I think only time will tell as to whether or not this indicates a moment of change. For us, with the work that we do within our organisations, we do think that workforce diversity is a way to make sure that there is a lasting change. But I think from David Lammy's opening, what we're seeing is that even where the numbers are great or the numbers are okay, once you break them down, for example, when you separate Black from BAME, once you start looking at the regions, so for example, at CPS, our 20% of BAME diversity is very much concentrated in London. Once you go out to our regions, there's still a lot more work to do. And I think for us, what we think is, and what we're hoping for, is that if this is a seminal moment where people are really listening and where people are really interested in having effective allyship, we as BAME individuals within our organisations won't have to do all the heavy lifting in going out into communities, in delivering these messages, because I think often for us, we do feel conflicted in the sense that often we're going out into our communities, increasing that confidence, feeding things back to our organisations, holding them accountable. And sometimes there's only so much that we can do. So I think from our perspective, we feel that there's a lot of change happening, but we want more. And I think it's important that we are within our organisations doing the work that we do. I'm going to leave it there because I know there's a lot more to say, but it's quite a packed agenda. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Hauwa. And can I also now ask Tanya Robinson to do an introduction? And thanks for the questions. So I'll be going straight to the questions after Tanya spoken.
Thank you, Junior. And thank you for inviting me to come and speak. I think it's a really relevant and important topic, and it's kind of in my work DNA. So I'm the current head of diversity and inclusion at HMPPS, which is the Prison and Probation Service. And I'm also the director of the Lammy programme. So we have 13 recommendations out of the 35 from the Lammy review that is specific to prisons and probation. And it was quite nice to hear that, and the acknowledgement that we have made progress within the Prison and Probation Service, but it's also really important to acknowledge that we've got a significant way to go. So just some background from me and who, my career. I've been in the civil service for 15 years, and I think I am a kind of example of how, social mobility can work. So I started off as a receptionist, a temporary receptionist at that, and I worked through the organisation doing various roles, frontline probation officer, to working on programmes within the MOJ. And prior to this role, I was managing the London CRC contract. I was the senior contract manager for that role. So I think I'm an example that it can be done, but I will also acknowledge that that it isn't easy to get through the organisation when you look around and everybody who's senior doesn't look like you or sound like you. But that has been acknowledged, and I think even prior to the Lammy review. So I've been in post for 2 years, and coming into this role, we wasn't even able to understand what our staffing looked like, what the profile looked like, because the staff declaration rates were so low that they weren't, I want to say this correctly now, statistically significant enough for us to kind of use that data. And in the 2 years that I've been in post, and we've put significant work in to try to encourage our staff to declare their protected characteristics. When we're thinking about a diverse workforce, that isn't just about race. It's a diverse thought, it's diverse background, it's diverse protected characteristics. But we need to understand what our baseline is before we can then say what we need to build on. So I think we're now in a good position in terms of understanding what our staff data is and what those protected characteristics are. As I say, so we've now got 90% have declared their ethnicity, which is a significant improvement. But we, and last year our recruitment drive and our push based on the Lammy recommendations, which is to state that our prison and probation staffing should represent the local population. So we've put that at a 14% baseline, but actually that's based on the 2011 census. We know that that's significantly increased. And we know places like London is closer to 50% is BAME. So we need to understand the regional variations. We need to ensure that our recruitment drives are specific to those locations, because a recruitment drive in London is going to be very different to what is going to be in the southwest or the northwest of England. So, I don't think we could give it a blanket brush. This shouldn't be a tick box exercise. If we're going to do it, we need to do it properly. And these are some of the things that we are trying to put in place to understand outreach to what's happening in those local areas with local organisations, because we've got a lot of learning to do. We've got a lot of listening to do, and that's part of what we are currently doing. So in the current climate, I think it would be remiss, as has been mentioned, that with the COVID-19 outcomes for BAME communities and the recent protests, I think we have to acknowledge that it isn't America. This isn't about a man who was murdered in America. This is something that is prevalent in our society. We can look to America and we can say, you know, it's terrible there, but actually our prisoner data is not much better in terms of disproportionate numbers within our prisons for BAME prisoners. And our workforce, we are very aware, needs to reflect the society that we serve, and that's our focus and that's our drive. But you know, I'm also going to, you know, acknowledge the fact that it's not going to be easy to replicate the numbers, the BAME percentages within Isle of Wight, for example, because we don't have the local population there to recruit from. So we're going to have to do some thinking about that, about how, you know, we can incentivize or, you know, get people to potentially move around. So there isn't a one fix wonder for this. You know, there's a lot of thought that is going into this, and I think it's really important to mention around, and it's one of the points in terms of retention. It's about acknowledging what the staff are going through at this current time. So as the head of D&I could be the total centre point in terms of, well, you're BAME, so, you know, what can you give us the answers? And the answers can't come from a group of people actually really quite tired. And it's got to be a unified, completely unified effort. We don't need to prove it anymore that there's disproportionate outcomes, right? We don't need to evidence it. It's there. We know it. So it's there. So what do we do about bringing about those changes? So what we're starting to do, and just this week, we've had some really powerful events where staff have just been very open. Black staff have been very open through our Proud Network, just having conversations and sharing what their experiences have been and what this current climate, what feelings that has evoked in them. And that's been a conversation, not just BAME speaking to BAME. We need to move beyond that. It was BAME staff speaking to white colleagues, which was really, really powerful. And I think that needs to be the beginning of it. We're a national, you know, geographically dispersed organisation, so things can't just come from the centre. They need to happen locally. And so plans are starting to be put into place so that we can have those conversations in more rural areas, in the local delivery units for probation offices and for prison regions. There's a lot to be done, and I'm really conscious that I can jabber on all day, and Junior's looking at me because of the time. So and we want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks, Junior.
Tola, Hauwa, and Tola, Hauwa and Tanya, thanks very much for the introductions. I've got quite a few questions that have come in, and thanks for those who have put them on the Q&A. So why don't I start at the top? Hillary's asked the question, what are your views on the removal of the Edward Colston in Bristol? I think this is statue. Is this a significant step in history to end institutional racism? I'll put that out to any of the panel members. Maybe Tola, you might want to start with that one for us.
Well, I've got some of the other questions, so I believe they're named to me. So shall I pass it over to Hauwa or to Tanya?
I'm happy. Well, from my personal perspective, I'm happy to respond. I think it's significant, and I think it's, you know, my personal opinion is that it's not before time that this has happened, and it needed to happen. I think that, but what we don't want to do is forget. There needs to be, these things need to be in a museum, and the actual kind of, you know, the British history, the actual slavery history needs to be acknowledged and remembered, and that generations can remember that, so that there's an acknowledgement of what Black people have been through through the history of time.
And Hauwa, do you have a personal view?
Yeah, very similarly to Tanya. I think one thing that was mentioned is sort of, I think a lot of people don't understand that we have a problem in this country, or they don't want to acknowledge it, and they think that the issue in America is so unique to America because of its history that's linked to slavery. And I think one brilliant thing that this will result in, and the conversation that has been sparked around these statues, is it's making people who were either ignorant, willfully or unintentionally, it's making them really understand this. And I think that when people understand it, we can hold the CJS more accountable. We can hold the CJS more accountable in this country once people actually understand. It's not about watching the news and saying, oh my God, that's terrible what's going on in America. What about what's going on at home? So that's my personal opinion.
Thanks very much. Tola, there are two questions that I can see that have been asked, one by Tamara, Kyle and Montel. Do you want to take each one of those in turn? So as president of the Black Policing Group, do you feel that there is scope for development of an independent Black police unit? And the second question is regarding the disproportionality for referrals for discipline and outcomes.
Well, regarding the Black Policing Unit, and I'm not sure if there is any precedence for that, my concern would be it could be diverse. It would pose all sorts of questions. On what basis would you regard somebody as being Black? Would it be self-defined? Would there be some measure of that? I prefer to talk about Black heritage because I've got 4 children, 2 of whom consider themselves Black, and 2, if they can get away with it, consider themselves white and benefit from white privilege, is what they tell me. So it could be quite difficult. And I think also, you know, I took an oath to police without fear or favour, and I think that needs to be respected. So yes, we are at the forefront. You may have seen some video of footage from West Midlands where Black officers were encouraged to go out and relate to the crowd, and we're taking a knee with them. I think that's the best thing we can do, because at the end of the day, if you've got an ongoing criminal matter, you want a police officer to turn up and you want them to deal with it professionally, regardless of what colour they are and what colour you are. And that's what we're striving for there to be no discrimination, both in terms of workforce, but how we deal with members of the public. In terms of the second question then, and this is an ongoing issue, which I didn't get around to referring to in my responses, but there was a significant piece of work done last year by DCC Deputy Chief Constable Phil Kane from North Yorkshire Police. It's on the NPCC website if you want to look it up under the name Phil Kane. And he looked at that disproportionality, which we've long been aware of within policing for Black and Asian police officers. And the headline figures are that you are twice as likely to be dismissed from the service if you are Black or Asian. This is not a new figure, and it actually goes back at least 12 years, and I've got the statistics to back that up. And I can give force level statistics with regard to that as well. So we've been aware of it, policing is now aware of it, the police chiefs are more aware of it than they've ever been. And as I say to them, well, actually, if you're going to recruit from our communities, they are aware of it as well. The issues go further back, and they go back in terms of being more likely to be in the system. But actually, here's the crux. There's 2 methods of getting into this system. One is internally, one is externally. And if it was possible for an ethnicity to be more likely to be disciplined, you'd expect both of those 2 to be proportionate. So the disproportionality comes solely from within policing, conduct matters that were raised within policing. From outside, complaints from members of the public, they are proportionate. So you're no more likely to receive a complaint from members of the public, whatever your skin colour or your ethnicity. But if you're within the service, you're more likely to get that from your colleagues. That is a huge issue. And we see, and the report links this to whistleblowing. So, yeah, we want people to join. We want people to be aware of these issues. But we want policing to deal with these issues as to why people are more likely to find themselves on the doorstep, as in the case of Robin Williams. I'm sure you'll be familiar with in the Met, if you're Black or Asian. And we still think these things links to, in certain cases, institutional racism. Lots of work to be done.
Great, thank you. However, there might be a quick answer to this. I saw this pop up whilst you were talking. It says, in relation to how can we help, do you accept volunteers? I think that's in relation to the CPS Muslim network.
Yes, we do. So I did post our Twitter handle, but you can also email us at muslimstaffnetwork@cps We do accept volunteers, and you can also be a member of both our Muslim network and our BAME network. Even if you're not a member of CPS staff, you can be an associate member.
Excellent, thanks very much for that. Let's hope that you get a increase in membership off the back of that. So a question for all panelists from Rebecca. Hauwa, you raised an important point regarding supporting staff. What advice can the panel give in relation to what types of relationships work with central government? How are these best mediated, and what works? Has potential to work in terms of following recommendations through for change. If I start from back to front, maybe Tanya, if you can pick that one up first, and then I'll work back from Hauwa to Tola.
That's a really big question, but in terms of, I suppose, supporting staff for an organisation of our size, and I think in my role and in my team, trying to get messages out, there's a lot of work that can happen in the centre, but actually people feel demotivated because they don't necessarily understand the work that's being done at that level. And one of my biggest challenges is about how we communicate to 45,000 staff that work in silos across the country. We do have staff networks, and they are full-time. So we have a race, we have Pride in prison and probation, and we have a disability network. And we're looking at how we can maybe expand that into other groups, because there is some intersectional stuff that actually gets missed in that. And we're looking at how we can ensure that we have more area leads within each of the areas, because we are such a geographically dispersed organisation, and we involve those networks, because I think it's how do we understand what the voice on the ground is. So we involve them in policies, we involve them in processes and procedures, but you know, there definitely is still more to be done. And what we're trying to do, I think, more of, and this is on the back of, you know, in the last couple of weeks, in the way that staff found a way to have a voice through different forums, like the Proud conversation, is how can we provide those platforms for staff to be able to air their views, air their concerns, so that we can directly respond to those. Because I think there is so much going on in the centre, we can over communicate, and I'm probably not answering the question, but it's how are we trying to support staff and encourage them and enable them to know that what the work that we are doing, because there is a lot being done to try to let staff know that they are being supported.
Thank you. And Hauwa?
I think then if I can try and maybe pick up on the part of the question that was talking about sort of linking with central government. I think for us at the CPS, I mentioned in my presentation that I personally feel that we have a bit of a branding issue still, and an awareness issue of sort of who we are, what we do. I think people engaged in the criminal justice system understand it. People who are not so much, as I said, the perception is they don't really know the role that we play. And I think that within our organisation, we definitely have a voice. We're brought to the table for a lot of conversations. I think we're seeing ourselves on more boards now, but there still could be more, because I think there's one thing about listening and having these difficult conversations, but the question talked about sort of recommendations and holding accountable. I don't feel that we yet have enough sort of power in that space. And I think, don't forget, some of that is to do with the structure that we have with staff networks. As I mentioned, these are people from these communities, more often than not, who are doing this alongside day jobs, although, of course, we have a diversity and inclusion team who that's their jobs. So I think the conversations are passed on to the right spaces, but we could still have more of that. I think within central government, again, CPS is a small but powerful organisation across government, if I can say that. And I think that when it comes to CJS issues, they do often, the government more widely does appreciate that we have expertise in certain areas and does bring us to certain conversations. But again, I think particularly with the spark in the Black Lives Matter movement that's happening now, I think there's hopefully a bigger appetite for us to be involved in holding people accountable to act on the feedback that we've been giving, if that makes sense.
It does, it does. And Tola, rather than answering the same question, I'm going to ask you a slightly different one, if that's okay. I'm quite conscious of time. How can we as a society get past the mistrust between young people and law enforcement? Do you have any personal views on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important issue. And when we talk about policing by consent and the public being the police and the police being the public, for me, that's central to our legitimacy to do what is effectively a coercive power. We have more powers as individual police officers than anybody else in the country, and individual constables have made more power even than their own chief constables in certain aspects. So it really does come down to those daily interactions that are carried out by police officers, and training needs to be done all the time. For example, very quickly, if you a police officer living in London and you live south of the river, but you're called to work in somewhere that's north of the river, say for example Harrow or something like that, do you understand about the issues that relate in that particular community? Do you understand about how it is to police that community, what the history is? So there needs to be some understanding on an individual basis, but very much so I think there's a longer term piece of work. And I'm glad to say in my own force area, and this is one of the reasons why I moved here recently, is they've done a longer term work, not just going into schools to try and attract people into policing as a short term measure, but actually going into junior schools and working with young people and to encourage them to understand why policing. Lots of forces have got junior cadets working with them to understand policing, because policing is here principally to protect people and to safeguard young people. But often they don't see that aspect of it. So we want people to see that, understand why we're here, so that the next time that they need something, we would be the first port of call, rather than thinking, oh, I don't trust the police and I won't go to the police.
Thank you very much for that, Tola. And can I also pass on thanks to Hauwa and Tanya, because that concludes the first half of our panelist session in questions and answers. I'm going to be very disciplined and make sure I try and stick to time. So I'm sure everyone on the Zoom chat and webinar will wish you and thank you for well, virtually anyway, very intensive and insightful session. So I'm now going to introduce Blessing Mukosha. Blessing, and she's the director of the Blessing at the Bar. Andrea Coomber, she's Director of Justice, and Kadra, or is it Kadra, Abdinasir, Charity So White. If I can start with an Arts Blessing to do a introduction, and if that can be done in about 5 minutes, I'd be really grateful.
Thank you, Junior. And I want to say thank you to everybody who's attended and also everybody who has spoken already. I am somewhat of the baby amongst the group of everyone here. I've qualified in the sense that I've completed bar school and I've been called. I'm currently working for Lambeth on an inquiry, so as a paralegal, and also Tola, I'm a Bristol resident, so I'm also speaking from Bristol, so shout out to Bristol. In essence, just to give a background as to who I am and what I do and why Nina asked me here. So Blessing at the Bar is a platform that I started in August 2017. I really started it from the perspective of I wanted there to be an honest and candid account of becoming a barrister from my perspective as a Black woman. And I thought that was important because I am a strange person. I'd wanted to be a barrister since I was 7. And whilst most kids were being normal and having lives, I was reading and learning about the justice system and learning about this amazing profession of being a barrister. And I had pretty much never deviated from that path, except for briefly when I wanted to become a pop star, and I still sort of do. So that's a future career goal. But currently the bar is basically everything to me. And with that experience that I've had with this platform over the 3 years, I've come to get to know other aspiring barristers, who are mature aspiring barristers, who are working class aspiring barristers, who are Black aspiring barristers, Asian aspiring barristers, Muslim aspiring barristers. And it's been a sensational experience for me because it's really highlighted to me how pertinent it is that the bar ups its game in regards to recruitment. And something else that I'm also doing is I'm very proud to be part of the committee of the Bridging the Bar initiative, which is an organization which has been created with the sole purpose of creating practical pathways to attainment and diversity at the bar. And that is really, in a nutshell, what I do. So I want to clarify and really build upon the points that have been made already, especially with respect to the value of having diversity and what it actually means for the practical functionings of our justice system. And I have 3 points that I want to make here today, and they center around courage and value. As my friends and I, my Black friends and I, have been responding to the aftermath of George Floyd's death, and also my non-Black friends, one thing that we've all come to realize is really important to us is courage. A lot of us are working in predominantly white offices, predominantly white spaces. I'm entering a predominantly white profession. And we've all been thinking about how we can have courage to continue to be loud with our voices and amplify each other's voices. And I think that's the lesson that can be shared when it comes to practical measures to improve recruitment. I'm looking specifically at the bar, but obviously that feeds into the wider criminal justice system. The first point I wanted to make is having courage to admit and recognize that you may not be the best place to recognize and reward value amongst people who look different to you. And that's where initiatives like Bridging the Bar come in. We have a mini pupillage program, which we envisage will enable us to recognize amongst our very diverse majority Black and ethnic minority committee, we will be putting talent in front of chambers, essentially allowing chambers to recognize that, hey, we maybe aren't the best at this. Decades have shown that perhaps we're not the best at this, but we recognize that you are able to see value and present that to us. So that's step 1. Point 2 I wanted to make is courage to allow yourself to be challenged by voices that don't sound like your own and don't express themselves the way you do. And a big point that I want to make there is social media. The trepidation towards social media amongst many members of the bar profession and within the criminal justice system more widely, I think is justified in some cases, but is missing that this is a language that the majority of an entire generation of lawyers speak. It is our fluency. We are fluent in this new sort of media. And so being able to embrace and recognize voices that don't sound like yours and don't express themselves the way that you do, I think is a massive barrier. And by doing that and actually embracing that, I think that recruitment could open up significantly. And the final point that I want to make, and it's a particularly salient point, is courage to believe in the skill and ability of those who do not look like you and overcome any internalized superiority you feel towards them or inferiority in the presence of them. I think that is the final point that I wanted to make, because whenever we talk about internalized bias and we talk about barriers to diversity, there's a sort of personal conversation that people have to have with themselves and ask themselves very candidly and honestly, do I feel comfortable in the presence of people who don't look like me? And I think getting comfortable with that discomfort is going to be a huge step that needs to be taken for recruitment to be achieved in a more diverse way. The end result of all of these things, as we've all discussed today and we'll go on to discuss, is having a criminal justice system that looks more like the people it's set out to represent. And also, the final thing is value. And that's what I wanted to emphasize. If we do want to have a fully functioning, healthy criminal justice system 10 years from now, we have to do this direct and foundational work now. The time for complacency and raising awareness and sort of saying diversity but not doing diversity is over. And I think now is the time for decisive and definitive action. And that's really what I want to promote and represent with my platform. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A as well.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So thank you very much, Blessing. I'm now going to hand over to Andrea.
Thank you, Junior. Thanks all for inviting me. I'm actually not in Bristol. I'm in Perth, Western Australia, where I'm in a hotel quarantine for 14 days. That's how quarantine happens here. There's a guard outside, and I'm afraid I'm locked up with my 9-year-old. So if a boy walks past wearing underpants, don't be too frightened. It's happened a couple of times in the last 5 days. I'm really pleased to be invited to speak at this event today. Justice which is the organisation I direct, has been raising concerns about the absence of Black, Asian and minority ethnic judges in our courts since 1992. It's been a priority of my directorship. We did a big report in 2017, which was actually just all picked up in David Lammy's report that he mentioned earlier. And then can you hear me? Yes? Have you heard any of this? Okay. My bloody internet connection's unstable. Okay. Can you hear me now? Just start shaking. Great. So we've done a report in 2017. We did an update earlier this year. I'm afraid there's nothing good to report. I would love to address the four things: recruitment, retention, progression, and measuring impact. Unfortunately, we're not recruiting enough BAME judges, so there's not really very much problem of retention. There's very little progression, and it's very difficult to measure impact. And I'm not being glib by saying that. The statistics are shocking. I'm going to speak briefly about why diversity matters in the courts. Then I'll tell you about the state of play as of today, and then I'll talk about key challenges and some solutions. So hopefully I don't need to convince this crowd that diversity matters. But diversity in the courts does matter for legitimacy. You know, there's that big gulf between people's defendants' backgrounds and the judges that they see in front of them. And that's a fundamental source of mistrust in the criminal justice system from BAME communities. There's also a serious problem of quality. If our judges are only being recruited from a very small group of basically white men at the bar, that is not in any way able to reflect the quality or bring that diversity of perspective and life experience, which strengthens decision making. And finally, there's fairness. There's a sense that our judges are selected through a system that acts without any sort of secret barriers. And this is important across the judiciary. Obviously, we have a lay magistracy. The magistracy is actually quite diverse compared to the rest of the judiciary. It's 12% BAME across the system, 29% in London. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the more senior judiciary. So I'm going to focus on the Crown Court, High Court, Court of Appeal and Supreme Court, because the more senior you get in the courts, the worse the stats get. So across all courts, we have 7% judges of BAME. That's the official statistics. So these include people who've self-identified as BAME. I mean, I'm afraid sometimes that doesn't necessarily result in people who look BAME, to be honest, and I'll explain a little what I mean about that. But today on the circuit bench, we have 4% of judges who are BAME, High Court 3%, which represents 3 judges, a Court of Appeal 1 judge, 2.5%, and 0 BAME judges on the Supreme Court. So these are statistics that are devastatingly low. In many countries, you have a tap on the shoulder. Here we have a whole process of appointment, application, selection exercises, interviews, and the judiciary are involved in those decisions but don't take the decision. But at the end of the day, we know that Black, Asian, minority ethnic candidates are applying for the judiciary. In 2018, 2019, 10% of applicants to the High Court were BAME. No appointments were made. We don't have the stats from last year's application rates yet, but we know that 1 Asian judge was appointed to the High Court. On the circuit bench, 10 to 13% of applicants are BAME, 3 to 4% of people are appointed. And it's even worse for the feeder roles of recorder and High Court deputy, where last year's deputy High Court judges, 24 appointments, all of them were white. And there's a tendency to blame the pool, to say that the bar's white, the solicitor's profession's white. But as David said, you know, there have been lots of BAME people entering the legal profession for a long time. 16% of the bar, 20% of partners in law firms. There is a pool, they're applying, they're not appointed. Big challenges we have is we don't know why. The Judicial Appointments Commission recognises that this is a problem, that overwhelmingly, statistically, BAME candidates are not getting appointed. It's currently doing a deep dive and we await the results of that, but we need to understand why. You also can't have progression of people through the system to the Supreme Court, to the Court of Appeal, when you don't have a pool. That's why we have no progression. And with 3 High Court judges and 1 Asian Court of Appeal judge, the numbers are shockingly small. They're also so small that you can't have an intersectional analysis. We don't know where race intersects with gender or sexuality or socioeconomic background. And finally, as David mentioned at the beginning, the BAME category is unhelpful because we do have Asian judges and an Asian pipeline, but we have no black judges at a senior level, is the horrible truth. And since Linda Dobbs was appointed by a tap of the shoulder, before the Judicial Appointments Commission was set up, there has not been a single appointment of a black person to the High Court or above. We have never had a black man as a judge at the High Court or above at a salaried role. And I think, frankly, this is disgraceful. So Justice has been calling for public targets with reporting obligations, a change in culture with real leadership. Again, the parole board should be an inspiration for the whole system, for taking a decision, sticking to it, making sure you meet your targets. All of these platitudes about things have never been better, changes around the corner, people have been saying it for 25 years, nothing changes. And the change that happens is too slow, it's too little. And there's finally that question about how merit's defined. You know, that merit is defined by reference to what the current cohort looks like, sounds like, approaches things. And when you have a cohort that is overwhelmingly from one racial group, that cannot be a way to select anybody. So I think this is critical, it's urgent. In 2020, I think rightly there should be outrage about the demographics of the judiciary. And you can certainly read more on Justice's website, and we'd love you to get involved in our work. That's all.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And you managed to stay online for that as well, and no 9-year-old son in the background. Can I ask Kadra to do an introduction?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Nina and Junior, for having me here today. And thank you to all the speakers before me, just really powerful contributions and tough act to follow. So I'm Kadra, and I'm an organizer at the Charity So White campaign. I will just preface what I have to say today by saying that we're not experts in the voluntary criminal justice sector specifically. Instead, I'll be talking about race representation within the charity sector more broadly, and the challenges and experiences people of colour face across the sector, which are more or less similar. So Charity So White, it launched last August off the back of some really racist and harmful training material that was being published and used by Citizens Advice UK. This was training for their volunteers about working with BAME communities, and the slides contained some really shocking information. So things in there like to consider when working with BAME communities included things like there's high levels of illiteracy within BAME communities. BAME communities are too cash-centric and family-centric, whatever that means, and that they don't trust authorities. So the campaign essentially lifted the lid on racism and discrimination within the sector, and we've known these things for such a long time. On the day of the campaign launch, we engaged and attracted 3,000 tweets on Twitter. And I just wanted to share some of the kind of personal experiences people shared using the hashtag on the day. So we've got here, Charity So White is when you can't even tweet about your horrific experiences because of the fear and backlash of bullying. Charity So White is being at a criminal justice networking event where everyone of colour are asked when they left prison. Charity So White is I turned down one guy for funding, not convinced his organisation was benefiting all communities equally. His response was, do you know that research shows that Black people are happier when they were in subordinate positions? I mean, it's truly shocking. And we've had even more disclosures over the last couple of weeks from people of colour working within the sector, calling out their organisation's hypocrisy in paying lip service to Black Lives Matter, when we know that racism is so entrenched and ongoing part of the work of the sector. We've known in terms of diversity and inclusion that it's a huge issue within the charity sector, as it is in other parts of work. The latest reports on representation in the sector, however, don't tell us anything new. But I will say that the charity sector seriously lags behind the private and public sector in terms of representation of people from BAME backgrounds. So research by Akivo shows that only 9% of employees within the voluntary sector come from BAME backgrounds. 99% of charity boards are predominantly white. Over half of people who've experienced discrimination, over half of people have experienced discrimination on the basis of their race and ethnicity within the charity sector. So the lack of data is not actually what is stopping us from changing the status quo. And for us, we're really keen to push this message that it's not just about diversity and inclusion, rather that we need to have the acknowledgement and acceptance within the sector that institutional racism permeates the work of the sector. And we want to have really open and honest conversations looking at race, power and privilege and how that plays out. We all hear about the white saviour complex that exists within the charity sector, and I'm sure that's no different within criminal justice VCS services. We want to see a fundamental shift in the structures across the charity sector, where leaders and decision makers reflect the communities they work with. And we also think that funders have a key role to play as well within this, because the charity sector somewhat operates in an autonomous way and are not required, to kind of publish or collate this information or report on it in a consistent manner. So just to say, at Charity So Why, over the last sort of year, we've been engaging with charity CEOs, infrastructure organisations such as NCVO and Akivo to really lead the conversation within the sector. We've been supporting BAME networks within the charity sector so that they can influence from within. And we've been supporting individuals who have disclosed experiences of racism within the sector. And I think it's really shocking to hear that, the kind of bodies that are there to kind of support employees within the sector are not fit for purpose when it comes to racism. And unfortunately, that's a really overlooked area. And we try and signpost people to specialists where we find the need. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Kadra, thank you so much for your introduction. I'm sure we're going to get lots of questions for yourself, Andrea, and Blessing. So I'm just going to pick up one or two of them that I know that have come in. And I'm going to start with actually the final one, actually. Can the panelists all list 2 systemic changes which, if they could, they would implement with full effect immediately?
I'm happy to start with that one. I think my first change would be to essentially, because most for example, commercial solicitor firms is one example, recognize that actually external HR managers or people who are specialists in talent, recognizing and rewarding talent are present. So my first change would be to change the entire recruitment structure in respect of the bar. And have it so that there are specialist trained people who have the skills and ability to recognize a diverse range of talent. And possibly tying onto that, a tangential point would be the use of organizations like Bridging the Bar in the way that I discussed previously. And I think the second point that I would make is, when I talked about going through and having these conversations, I think this also feeds into what Andrea mentioned and was discussing about how they're doing a deep dive to try and understand what the issues are when recruiting at the judiciary. I think having an open forum and having regularly accessible open forums to discuss internalized bias in a non-judgmental way, but in a way that allows people to confront their own bias and allow colleagues to confront each other with the aim of practically moving forward. So I would want those 2 things to exist.
Thank you. Andrea?
Sure. I mean, immediately for the judiciary, I would have targets with reporting obligations to explain what's been done to meet them. That's the official justice line. Personally, I would have quotas because the thing that could be said for them is that they work. But Justice's position is that we would have targets, but David and I have now convinced each other that we should go for quotas. I think there should be along the lines of what Blessing was suggesting, like an independent expert review of the merit criteria and the way it's assessed for what a good judge looks like, what a good judge is and does, because we have defined that simply by reference to what we already have. And my deep concern is that when people in the system talk about recruiting diversely, what they really want is they want what they've already got. They just want it to have darker skin and boobs, to be crass and Australian about it. But fundamentally, they want what they've got. They just want it to come in a different package. And they don't recognise that actually when you recruit diversely, you get different stuff. And that's part of the strength of diversity. And so you need to be recruiting for something different. And I think while we're just recruiting for what we've already got and hoping that it will be packaged differently, we're not going to get too far.
Thank you very much. And can I ask Kadra to answer as well, please?
Thank you. I would say, firstly, acknowledgement of racism within the sector and the barriers that people face. I think, you know, on an entry-level setting, it's really difficult to get into the sector. So just personally speaking, I was working 2 jobs and taking on an unpaid kind of internship. So the routes into the sector itself, I think, need to be massively reformed. And I think, you know, reviewing the criteria that they have for entry-level positions where they're asking for really advanced qualifications or years in service is a real barrier. The second thing I would say is for the charity sector to stop operating from a deficit model. And that affects both how they kind of attract BAME employees, but also how they work with the communities that they serve. So I think a true kind of unmeaningful co-produced kind of strategy around that would be something I would want to see, and also transparency around that. So there is a real lack of transparency around decision-making within the sector, which means that decisions are made by very few powerful individuals. And so we've been trying to challenge that through the campaign.
Thank you very much, Kadra. A question for Andrea. Are there any lessons to be learned or examples of good practice in supporting progression amongst the judiciary?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, I mean, the judiciary have been really keen to have outreach into new communities. The problem has been that that's into non-traditional candidates, by which they mean Black people, women, and people from socioeconomic backgrounds that are non-traditional, public school, state school education. And some of them have appear to have been successful in encouraging application to the courts. What we don't know is we haven't had evaluation and monitoring of those programs to the extent that we know that they actually work. What we do know that works is sort of, I'm not even sure what the word is, mentorship, sponsorship of people. I mean, that's what currently happens in barristers' chambers. So if I was a barrister in chambers and I wanted to become a judge, I would go to somebody from the chambers who'd been a judge or become a recorder or a deputy high court judge and talk to them about what to do. And the problem is that those opportunities are limited to those people who can get pupillage, can get tenancy, and we know the demographics of the bar are terrible. So you're just much more likely to be a white man to be in that position that you then can have those relationships and create those relationships. But there are some BAME judges who spend an awful lot of their time doing events, reaching out to people, networking, supporting, mentoring. I mean, they personally do an amazing job, but frankly, there just aren't enough of them to be able to provide that one-on-one support that people really need in order to be able to progress.
Thank you very much. I've got a question, I think it was for Kadra actually. How can we do more to get more support for charities working in the BAME communities?
Sure. Actually, we've been doing quite a lot of work on this recently. So there was some research that came out last month by the Ubele Initiative that actually showed the disproportionate impact COVID-19 is having on BAME-led organisations. So it's really shocking, but they found that around 9 out of 10 BAME-led organisations were at risk of closing shop within the next 3 months, just because they often are reliant upon very short-term contracts. And that again comes back to kind of the systemic racism within the sector, that there's that lack of trust between funders, government, and those kind of smaller grassroots BAME-led organisations. But I am happy to say that, so we put together an open letter calling on funders to prioritise funding for BAME-led organisations, with the key ask within that they ring-fence 20% of their funding for BAME-led organisations, not only because the charities are at risk of closure, but we also know that BAME communities are being disproportionately impacted by the pandemic anyway, and are likely to kind of suffer long-term consequences associated with that. So we've been having really positive conversations with funders like Comic Relief, who have, they put out a call to work with a BAME intermediary body to distribute their emergency funding. So hopefully other funders will do the same, and that this kind of put the issue on the agenda for funders and for government. So we are making some slow progress.
Excellent. Do any of the other panelists have any views on that? That's really well answered. Thank you, Kadra. No? Okay. So was you going to answer, Andrea?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I have, I've worked in NGOs now since 1998. So what, 23 years? Very old. But I mean, and I think it is a sector that has a tendency, I mean, Kadra mentioned the kind of white messiah complex. It is a sector that has a tendency to think that you can treat people like shit because you are doing a greater good. And I've seen such bullying and terrible behaviour in charities that would frankly never be able to exist in the city sector or in government. You just would never get away with it because there isn't the professional management, whatever. I think one of the big obstacles to more progression is all of these unpaid internships that people are meant to sort of collect 1 million unpaid internships, in addition, as Kadra said, to working full-time, studying full-time. I mean, at Justice, we have a policy, we only have paid internships. It means you get amazing people apply. Blessings, a former Justice intern, offering herself up as an amazing person. But you just, I mean, besides the fact that it's fairer and you're treating people with decency and giving opportunities to the best, but you get the best people. You don't get the best people when you only get people who can afford to work for free for you, in our case, in London, for 3 months. It is a massive obstacle. And in a profession like law, where the further you get those opportunities to step up by having opportunities of internships, if you're only offering those internships to people who can afford to pay to do it for free, you're automatically setting a very low ceiling for certain people. I think it's a disgrace.
Perhaps a question for Blessing, actually, then maybe Andrew afterwards. How do we get through to magistrates and courts to help them understand that they are disproportionately discriminating against Black and ethnic minorities?
I would have to caveat my response with this that I am the baby of the group, experience-wise. But I think looking at any profession, any industry, when it comes to approaching and challenging change, encouraging change, that comes with having the courage to challenge. And I think if there is a change in the culture, in the sense that, from everybody down to court ushers, to the clerks, to fellow magistrates, know that if they call out and challenge colleagues for problematic behavior or for making problematic or unjust decisions in their role, then I think then we could possibly see much more internal policing and an actual internal push and change towards having more fair outcomes. And I think that would work. I appreciate that when it comes to magistrates, that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But I would say, and this again reflects back to the time that I spent at Justice. So I wanted to shout out Andrea and actually the entire Justice team, because when I was there, had the opportunity to conduct in-depth research into the roles and functionings of different people in our courts. And by doing that, I came to understand that really, if you have a commitment to changing the culture within any institution, and that you protect people who are going to challenge their colleagues within that institution, then you can actually see that wider systemic change start to happen and start to move.
Thanks very much. I've got a question here that's coming from Rahil. It says, the NHS has been releasing data on the number of Black and brown people who have been dying from COVID-19. The data helps with saving lives and highlights systemic racism. It says, why is HMPPS and MAJ not releasing data on ethnicity of numbers of prisoners and staff who have died and been infected. I don't know if Tanya's still on, but maybe that's one we can probably pick up afterwards. I know we do have numbers that have been released in terms of their totality, but I'm not sure that if we've released that in terms of ethnicity. Tanya, are you still on, or should I just move on to the next question? Okay, I think she's probably gone off to another meeting. I think one of the other questions I've seen here, following the McPherson report, maybe one to all the panelists, will independent oversight be reinstated as was disbanded a little while ago from what I understand? Maybe in asking the question, the guys on the panel might not know the answer to that, but I would be interested to get your views on whether it should be. Maybe if I start with Andrea on that one.
I'm afraid I can't see the question.
So let me go back.
Sorry. Sorry.
So the questions from Caroline. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. The questions says, following the McPherson report, will independent oversight be reinstated as was disbanded a little while ago from what I understand? You might not know whether it's going to be reinstated, but I just wonder whether you had a view on whether it should be if it's following its disbandment.
I'm afraid that's not something I know enough about to feel like I can comment on, I'm afraid. But I defer to other people who would.
Do we have anyone on the panel who would be able to give a view on that?
Not for me, no.
No. Okay.
Sorry, Junior, I might be able to help, but obviously the CPS is independently reviewed and commissioned. The police, there's an independent police complaints commission. I do think those independent commissions have an important role to play in holding the organisations accountable, and just the fact that they are independent. So they do exist for a lot of the criminal justice organisations. Unfortunately, I can't speak for all of them, but I know that they do exist. And what I will say is that as an internal staff member, I know that these reports, these annual reports and commissions, they do go into quite a lot of detail, and they really go into, for example, independent departments and teams and units. And there definitely is a sense within, particularly the CPS, that it doesn't look good if you don't do well on this commission report. So I don't think they're just useless reports that they make. I think the targets they set and the results that they publish within the organisations are definitely something that has impact and has effect, and often does sort of spur some change.
Yeah, and actually maybe I can help out here as well. So as the Deputy Director for all of the arm's length bodies and scrutiny bodies that go in and inspect prisons and probation and court and parts of the court service, I can also say that all of those organisations who are independent from the ministry, they do provide really invaluable insight, and what they do does lead to demonstrable change. It's also important that the system remains transparent as well. So I think they have a crucial role to play in all that we do across criminal justice. Okay, so go ahead.
Just that, sorry. Just to explain that another, as well as this work stream about a fit for purpose workforce, one of our other work streams at the Criminal Justice Alliance is around scrutiny and accountability. And Amal Ali, our policy officer, is not just going to be doing work on this work stream, but she's also leading a piece of work that's looking at those independent scrutiny bodies. So we did a piece of work around Stop and Scrutinise, which is around community scrutiny of stop and search. And the College of Policing are about to publish some new professional practice about how community scrutiny could be improved for stop and search. And then we're now looking at working with ICFA, Independent Custody Visitors Association, and with the independent monitoring boards in prisons to look specifically at issues around race and equality, both in terms of the monitoring, but also in terms of representation of volunteers as well. So it's something that we're going to be working on over the next year that overlaps as well with this piece of work.
So why don't I just make a public commitment that we can touch base on that, so we can, so I can give you access into the 6 that I sort of like look after.
Thanks, Junior.
Brilliant. Okay. I think we may have time for one more question. If there is another question that's been posted, let me just take a quick look.
I think someone had a question for me in there, but I don't know if that's the one you want to go for.
If you know what it is, maybe say what the question is and give an answer.
Great. Yeah. So the question said, what can the bar do right now to address structural barriers to diversity? And I wanted to respond to that question with the acknowledgement that financial barriers to becoming a barrister is still a huge problem that a lot of people have to take into account when making the decision. And even if you've made a commitment to, say, for example, study the bar course, and you found a way to either self-fund or get a scholarship for around the £20,000 just to study, it's smaller hurdles like I think it's £150 bar aptitude test that you have to sit before you can start the bar course. And that's just one element of the structural barriers that are in place. So something I had a conversation with a quite senior member of the judiciary about this. And, you know, I was being educated on how the bar used to function and how it's developed over the years. And we discussed whether it would be more appropriate and sensible to reform the bar in the sense that if you were studying the bar course, you were only doing that with the knowledge that there would be a place for pupillage for you at the end, either confirmed beforehand or that there is an equal number of pupillage places as there is on the bar course. And I think by virtue of having a system that works the way it currently does, where there is absolutely no guarantee after you've made a significant financial, mental, and emotional commitment to complete the academic stage of your training, I think that is how the bar currently as it stands isn't fit for purpose in terms of allowing and enabling diverse recruitment into the profession, because it starts the pigeonholing early and then it fits into exactly what Andrea has been emphasizing and Justice's research has set out very explicitly and clearly, that if you do not have a diverse pool to begin with, then everything afterwards, of course, isn't going to be diverse. So I would really say in terms of structural changes, the financial barriers and the actual systemic barrier by the way that the institution itself is structured needs to change. And as soon as you see that change, I think then everything else that feeds into that, so that's judicial retainment, judicial recruitment, retainment of Black barristers and minority ethnicity barristers at the bar, will also change in and of itself. It'll lift the whole system up, in my view.
Junior, can I also just briefly jump in on that as well?
Sure, Hauwa.
I also think because of the model of the way that the bar works with barristers being self-employed and operating out of chambers, there is such a lack of accountability when it does come to diversity and inclusion in these spaces. And I know that for a lot of friends that I have who are Black or who are BAME or who are from a minority ethnic background, they actually left the bar because they got sick and tired of microaggressions, the kind of things that are said amongst barristers at the self-employed bar, you could never get away with saying in an organisation in this day and age. And I am coming up to 5 years post-qualified, so it's not too distant a memory for me. Some of the things, and I'm sure Blessing can attest to this, some of the things that, for example, are said in pupillage interviews, that's a recruitment process. And some of the outrageous things, and you sit there and you smile because you want the job. And for me, I know that it got to the point where I thought, do I want to enter this establishment? And I actually ended up going to the employed bar because I knew that even if there's discrimination there, I can hold people accountable. I think that I have seen changes. A lot of chambers now do have a diversity and inclusion lead, but I don't think there's enough. I think there are organisations trying to change that, but when you have a group of self-employed people, there's only so much you can do. It's an institution that people are talking today about a lack of progress. The self-employed bar, it's shocking. And I think it's about diversity, but it's also, once we're in those spaces, some of the things that people have to put up with to be able to stay in those spaces, they shouldn't have to.
Can I just thank all of the panelists for being incredibly honest. I have taken away so much understanding and learning about the wider criminal justice system, not just the bit that I'm sort of like responsible for and sit in. It's been incredibly insightful, and I genuinely hope that the our virtual delegates that are listening have also taken away some learning and some things that they can go away and think about and help us to improve on, actually. So I'd just like to again thank Tola, Hauwa, Tanya, Blessing, Andrea and Kadra for your input. It has been immensely helpful and insightful. And just so we don't lose this, so we are planning some follow-up workshops towards the end of this month and the beginning of July. And the workshops again will be an opportunity for us to build on the conversation we've just had here today, but also it will also allow us to share some of the learning that we've referenced from the event that we held last year. And again, they'll focus on the 4 key areas that we've been talking about. So at the end of today, we will send round a survey to all attendees following this event, asking them to register their interest for the workshops, which probably will be virtual again, but we would really appreciate your input, because this has been incredibly insightful. And to all those of you that have asked questions and left comments, we thank you for those as well. Let me just hand over to Nina to close.
Thanks, Junior. Absolutely, I agree. I mean, the Criminal Justice Alliance, we're an organisation that has a membership of 160 expert organisations, and they work right across the criminal justice system. And in order to tackle systemic racism, we need to take a systemic approach to these sorts of issues, and that was the idea of bringing together our speakers from right across the criminal justice system and looking at it really holistically. And I think that's why we need kind of a national kind of strategic plan. And also to learn good practice. There's so many nuggets of good practice that are happening that our panelists have talked about, and we really want to be able to capture them and share them across the system. So this is the start. Hopefully this is a catalyst for further discussion. As Junior said, the next steps you'll hear from Jamie in our office, who'll send everyone that's attended today a survey monkey so that you can fill in which of the workshops that you want to get involved in around recruitment, retention, progression and impact. And Amal Ali, who's our new policy officer, will be leading on those workshops, and she'll be drawing together all the learning and also putting together, as we said, recommendations for policy and practice. So thank you very much, Junior, for working with us. It's great to be able to work in partnership with the MOJ on this, and for all our incredible speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.